Hollywood, 1953. A young actor opens his morning paper at a diner counter on Cahuenga Boulevard and finds his name in a column, not praised, not condemned, simply placed, beside a rumor, inside a sentence written by a woman he had met exactly once, at a studio party 6 months prior. He will not work again for 2 years. The column has already moved on. This is Behind the Throne. And this is not the story of Hollywood's glamour machine. This is the story of the woman who operated it, and what it cost every person who stood too close to the gears. Chicago, May of 1937. A studio publicist named Harry Brand sat down at his desk before 7 in the morning, before his secretary had arrived, before the phones had begun their day-long ringing. He did not pour his coffee first. He did not open the trade paper that had been slipped under his door. He reached instead for Luella Parsons' column, which had arrived in the morning edition of the Los Angeles Examiner, and he read it with the specific, focused attention of a man checking a battlefield map. What it said about his studio's pictures would determine in no small measure what 40 million Americans believed about them by afternoon. He read carefully. He had learned to read carefully. This is not a story about Hollywood glamour. It is a story about what power looks like when it wears the face of enthusiasm, and what it costs the people who stand in its way. She was born Luella Rose Udinger in Freeport, Illinois, in the year 1881, and she grew up in Dixon, a small city along the Rock River that had the particular character of a place that believed itself to be on the way to somewhere larger. Dixon was not without ambition. It simply did not yet know what form that ambition would take. For Luella, it took the form of words. Specifically, the words in newspapers, which she consumed with a voracity that her family found both admirable and slightly puzzling, given that newspapers were not, in the late 1890s, considered a natural destination for a girl of her circumstances. She was not a girl who accepted that framing. Her father, Joshua Udinger, ran a small real estate operation that gave the family a degree of respectability without much stability. Her mother, Helen, read to her children in the evenings. It was from these two facts: a father who understood that the world ran on transactions, a mother who understood that it also ran on stories, that Luella assembled the practical philosophy she would carry into every room she ever entered. She understood earlier than most that a story was itself a transaction, that the person who controlled the telling of a thing controlled something more durable than the thing itself. She attended Dixon High School and then the Illinois State Normal University for a single year before withdrawing, a fact that would be smoothed over and occasionally reinvented in the biographical notes attached to her column for the next 5 decades. What she took from that year was less academic than social, an understanding of how institutions worked, who was deferred to and why, and what it felt like to be the person in the room who was paying closer attention than anyone else. Her first byline appeared in the Dixon Evening Telegraph sometime around the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, when she was still in her late teens. The precise date has not survived with certainty, which is itself a small historical irony. The woman who would spend 30 years cataloging the first appearances of others left her own first appearance only partially documented. What is known is that she was writing about local social occasions, the kind of small-scale society coverage that newspapers of that era carried as a matter of routine, and that she was doing it with a fluency and a particular sharpness of observation that her editors noticed. She married young, briefly, and badly. Her first husband, John Parsons, gave her the name she would carry to immortality and very little else of lasting value. The marriage lasted only a few years, and it left her with a daughter, Harriet, and with a clarity about self-sufficiency that she would not have arrived at through any easier route. She kept his name because it was the name on the bylines she had already accumulated, and because she understood, with the pragmatism that defined her at every stage, that names in print carried their own equity. By the time she reached Chicago in the years just before the First World War, she was already something more than a society columnist. She had begun writing about a new form of entertainment that most of her colleagues regarded as a passing novelty: the motion picture. Where others saw a carnival attraction, Luella Parsons saw an industry. She saw it with a specificity that was neither romantic nor cynical, but structural. She understood that people would pay to see stories, that the stories would need to come from somewhere, that, The somewhere would require organization and money and promotion, and that the promotion would require journalists willing to take it seriously. She was willing. She was more than willing. She was, in those early years, genuinely excited by what she was watching come into being, and that excitement was not a performance. Biographer Samantha Barbas, who spent years in the Hearst archive examining Parsons' correspondence, found letters from this period in which the enthusiasm is unmistakable. The letters of a woman who believes she has found the subject that was waiting for her. Her column moved to the Chicago Record Herald around 1914, where she was given a regular space to cover the picture business. She wrote about the films, the actors, the studios, the emerging grammar of screen performance, and she wrote about it with a specificity and an authority that distinguished her from the generalist reporters who parachuted in occasionally to file impressionistic pieces about the curious new art form. She had sources. She cultivated them deliberately, understanding that a journalist's value was proportional to the exclusivity of what she knew. She knew things because people told her things, and people told her things because she had made herself the one reporter in Chicago who treated the picture business as worthy of serious, continuous attention. William Randolph Hearst entered this story in the early 1920s, and his entry changed everything. Hearst was, by that point, the most powerful publisher in America, running a chain of newspapers with a combined reach that no individual voice in American journalism could match without his distribution. He had also, by that point, developed a personal interest in the picture business through his relationship with Marion Davies, the actress whose career he had decided to champion with the full weight of his organizational resources. He needed, among other things, a columnist who understood the industry, had credibility within it, and could be trusted to serve the interests of Hearst Enterprises while appearing to serve only the interests of her readers. Luella Parsons was that columnist. The arrangement that developed between them was mutual and unequal from the first day. She brought genuine talent, genuine sources, and a genuine readership. He brought the syndication infrastructure that would transform a Chicago column into a national institution, placing her words in over 400 newspapers before the decade was finished. What the arrangement cost her in independence, in the specific debts she would accumulate to a patron whose interests were not always her own, was not yet visible. The machinery was just beginning to turn. The column went fully national through the Hearst Syndicate in 1925. That year, in newsrooms from Boston to San Francisco, editors who had never before printed anything about the picture business began running her dispatches on the entertainment pages, and their readers, who were also in growing numbers, the audiences filling the new picture palaces on Saturday evenings, read them with a hunger that surprised everyone except Luella. She was not surprised. She had understood what movies would become when almost no one else did. That understanding was real, and it was earned, and it would not remain innocent for long. The column was live. The machinery was humming. A critic had become something else entirely, and the full weight of what that meant had not yet arrived. The column went national through the Hearst Syndicate in 1925, and the word national does not adequately describe what that meant. It meant that on any given morning in over 400 newspapers from Portland to Atlanta, from the small dailies of the Iowa river towns to the broadsheets of New York and Chicago, readers opened their papers and found Luella Parsons telling them what was happening in Hollywood. It meant that the studio publicists who had once regarded her as one reporter, among several now regarded her as something closer to a force of weather, unpredictable in its specifics, certain in its arrival, and capable of doing significant damage if you were standing in the wrong place when it moved through. She had earned this. That fact is worth holding on to because the story of what the column eventually became can obscure the story of what made it possible in the first place, and those are not the same story. In the years between her arrival at the Hearst Syndicate and the column's full flowering as a national institution, Luella Parsons demonstrated repeatedly and specifically that she understood the picture business with a clarity that most of her contemporaries lacked. She was among the first journalists in America to argue, in print and with conviction, that the studios were not producing entertainments but manufacturing a new form of cultural experience, and that the people who made that experience, the actors, the directors, the writers working under the contract system, deserved sustained attention rather than occasional curiosity. Her early scoops were genuine. In 1927, she broke the story of Al Jolson's performance in The Jazz Singer before the picture had been formally announced. having cultivated sources at Warner Brothers with the patient, deliberate attention of someone who understood that trust, once established, was worth more than any single piece of information it eventually yielded. She was right about sound. She had been right about the studios. The industry learned to respect her, and the respect was not entirely separable from a more complicated feeling that began, in those years, to develop alongside it. Because what the industry also learned in those same years was what happened when you did not return her calls. It was never dramatic in the early years. A picture that did not receive a mention in the column during its first week of release was a picture that 40 million readers did not hear about at breakfast. A star whose contract negotiation Luella had been briefed on by a rival studio suddenly found that the rival studio's version of events was the one that appeared in print. These were small things. They accumulated. The studio system ran, in those years, on a kind of managed information economy, and Luella Parsons was, increasingly, the most important single node in that economy. The industry learned to feed the node or accept the consequences. Most chose to feed it. She believed during this period that she was performing a genuine service. The record suggests she was not entirely wrong. The column introduced millions of Americans to films they would otherwise not have heard of, to performers they would not otherwise have followed, to an industry that was reshaping American culture in ways that most cultural institutions had not yet registered. Her enthusiasm was real, and it was contagious, and it moved product in ways that the studios understood and valued. She was doing something that mattered. The complexity, the part that did not resolve cleanly, is that she was also doing something else. By the late 1920s, the Hearst relationship had solidified into something more specific than a distribution arrangement. William Randolph Hearst had built a small film production company, Cosmopolitan Pictures, primarily to produce vehicles for Marion Davies, the actress with whom he had maintained a long personal relationship. Davies was talented, genuinely so, in ways that the comedy roles Hearst steered her toward did not always allow her to demonstrate. But she was also the beneficiary of a promotional apparatus that went well beyond ordinary studio publicity. Luella Parsons was a central mechanism of that apparatus. San Simeon, the vast coastal estate where Hearst hosted the industry's most powerful figures on weekends that functioned simultaneously as social occasions and business negotiations, was a place Luella knew well. She was among the regulars. She understood what the hospitality cost and what it purchased. She understood specifically that Hearst's investment in Davies's career was not a subject her column would examine critically, and that this understanding was not an editorial position she had arrived at independently. It had been made clear to her in the way that things are made clear in rooms where power is concentrated and the furniture is very good. What Luella knew about Hearst and what she chose not to print is a matter that biographer Samantha Barbas examined with particular care in her study of the Parsons archive. There were things in the record, rumors about Hearst's finances, about his political activities, about the precise nature of his arrangement with Davies, that a journalist with Luella's sources and her access could not have missed. None of them appeared in her column. The silence cost her something in the long run, in the credibility that accumulates only when a reporter is willing to report what her patron would prefer unprinted. What it bought her in the short run was protection, continued access, and the distribution infrastructure that made her reach impossible to replicate. She was, in this sense, not only the most powerful voice in Hollywood, but also one of the most structurally constrained. She had genuine power, and she was also being used. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other out. It was in this period that she championed the career of a young actress named Claudette Colbert, whose early sound pictures had received indifferent attention from the trades. Luella wrote about Colbert with a specificity and a warmth that distinguished the coverage from ordinary promotional notice. She described what Colbert did technically, how she handled a scene's transitions, what her voice brought to dialogue that had been written for a silent film cadence. And the coverage was consequential. Colbert's standing in the industry shifted measurably in the early 1930s, and more than one executive at Paramount attributed part of that shift to the attention Luella had directed toward her. This was the column at something approaching its best, a genuine critical intelligence identifying genuine talent and using genuine reach to amplify it. The column was capable of this. It was also capable of something considerably darker, and the machinery that produced both outcomes was identical. A positive item and a negative item came from the same typewriter, moved through the same syndication channels, landed on the same 400 breakfast tables. What determined which kind of item a given actor or studio received was a question that had less to do with merit than with compliance. The industry understood this by the early 1930s. Most of them had adjusted their behavior accordingly. The ones who had not were still learning. There was a morning in the spring of 1937 when a young actress named Constance Bennett walked into the offices of RKO Radio Pictures and found that the project she had been promised, a leading role in a prestige production that her agent had been negotiating for the better part of 6 months, had been quietly reassigned. No letter had been sent, no call had been made to her agent. The part had simply moved to another actress, and when Bennett's representatives pressed the studio for an explanation, the explanation that came back was indirect and brief, and carried within it the unmistakable residue of a column item that had appeared in the Los Angeles Examiner 3 weeks earlier, in which Luella Parsons had noted, with the particular delicacy she reserved for items that were meant to wound without appearing to, that Miss Bennett's temperament on her most recent production had been, as Luella phrased it, a source of some concern to those working with her. No source was named, no incident was specified. The item was 4 lines long. Bennett had in fact been difficult on the set of that production. This was not entirely a fabrication. But the characterization Luella chose, the framing, the timing, the specific placement of the item in the column on the morning that RKO's casting meeting was scheduled, was not accidental. A studio publicist who worked for RKO during that period recalled, years later, that the item had been the subject of direct conversation in the meeting. It had been read aloud. The reassignment followed within the hour. This was how the machinery operated at its most refined. A negative item did not need to be false to be a weapon. It needed only to be precisely timed, carefully worded, and delivered to the right breakfast tables on the right morning. Luella had spent 15 years developing the instinct for all three, and by the late 1930s, that instinct had become something closer to a reflex. The war years that followed did not slow the column, they amplified it. Between 1941 and 1945, with the country's attention fixed on the Pacific and the European theater, the studio system operated at a pitch of productivity and public visibility that it would never quite match again. The government had identified Hollywood as a crucial instrument of morale, and the studios had responded with an output that was staggering in its volume and, in certain cases, in its quality. Luella's column ran through all of it, 6 days a week, syndicated to more papers than ever, read by soldiers' families at kitchen tables in cities and in towns that had sent their youngest away and were waiting, with a patience that was indistinguishable from dread, for word of how the world was going. She wrote about bond drives and studio canteens. She wrote about which stars had enlisted and which were serving in ways the public could not fully know. She wrote about the pictures themselves with a warmth that, in those years, carried genuine feeling. She had loved the movies before she had feared what the column could do, and in wartime that original love surfaced with more frequency than it had in the 30s. The column was, for a brief period, something close to what she had imagined it might become in those early years in Dixon. A sustained, serious, affectionate account of an art form that the country needed. But the machinery had not stopped running simply because the tone had softened. The trades between studios and columnists continued through the war as they had before it, and the system of reciprocal obligation, information in exchange for protection, silence in exchange for access, remained the column's operating foundation regardless of what appeared on its surface. The human cost continued to accumulate, largely out of public view, in casting offices and producers' meetings where a mention in Luella's column, or the absence of one, carried consequences that the column's readers could not see and were not intended to see. By the late 1940s, those consequences had begun to show in Luella herself. She was 66 years old, and the effort of maintaining the column, the 6-day schedule, the constant cultivation of sources, the management of the information economy she had built, and that had, in certain respects, come to own her as thoroughly as she owned it, had begun to accumulate in visible ways. Her drinking, which had been a feature of her private life since at least the 1930s, had become more difficult to contain. Her health required interventions that the Hearst organization managed discreetly, as it had managed so many other things about her, because Luella's incapacity was a problem the organization could not afford to have made public while the column's value remained high. She wrote through it. This was the thing that her critics and eventually her historians found difficult to fully account for: the relentlessness of the output, the consistency of the voice across decades of physical and psychological cost. Whatever else the column was, it was also an act of will sustained over 30 years by a woman who had been told in various ways and by various people throughout her life that the kind of ambition she carried was not intended for someone of her circumstances or her sex. She had not accepted that. The column was the proof she offered, every morning, to no one in particular. The isolation that accompanied it was real and largely unexamined. She was simultaneously the most recognized name in Hollywood journalism and one of the most genuinely alone people in the industry. The studios needed her and did not trust her. The stars cultivated her and feared her. The Hearst organization valued her and had, over many years, made it sufficiently clear that the value was contingent on the column's service to Hearst interests, which meant that the independence she might have developed, the editorial distance that would have made the column something other than what it had become, was never fully available to her. In the spring of 1938, a writer named Adela Rogers St. John's, who had known Luella since the early newspaper years, spent an afternoon with her in the house in Beverly Hills where Luella had lived since the early 1930s. What St. John's remembered afterward was not the conversation but the room, the typewriter on the desk by the window, the papers arranged with a precision that suggested ritual, the quality of quiet that settled over everything when the telephone was not ringing, the column waiting to be written, the column always waiting to be written. Then, in the autumn of 1938, a woman named Elda Furry walked into the offices of the Los Angeles Times and took a job writing a rival column under the name Hedda Hopper. She was 62 years old, and she had been a moderately successful actress in the silent era, and she had been recruited, quietly, deliberately, by executives at MGM who had grown tired of the terms Luella's column imposed, to be exactly what Luella had been for Hearst, an instrument. The industry had created Luella Parsons. Now, with the same structural logic and without a trace of sentiment, it created another one. Hedda Hopper's column in the Los Angeles Times had been running for less than 2 years when the studios began, quietly and without fanfare, to route certain information her way that would previously have gone to Luella. The shift was not announced, it did not need to be. Studio publicity departments operated on the logic of managed relationships, and the management of those relationships required, periodically, that the balance of dependency be redistributed. Luella had become, by the early 1940s, expensive to maintain, not in money, but in the specific currency of obligation, access, and the accumulated weight of what she knew and what she had agreed not to print. A second columnist, one who owed her position to different patrons and had not yet accumulated the same debts, was structurally useful to the industry in ways that had nothing to do with the quality of the journalism either woman produced. Hopper understood this. She was not naive about the terms of her own installation. What she brought to the arrangement that Luella could not offer was the appearance of competition, the suggestion to readers and to the stars who were now courted by 2 rival columns rather than one, that the information economy had an alternative route, a second door. For a brief period in the mid-1940s, the competition between them was real enough to generate genuine scoops and genuine enmity. Hopper broke stories that Luella had been sitting on, either out of obligation to Hearst interests or because the studio involved had fed her a preferred version of events. The industry watched with the quiet satisfaction of a party that had successfully introduced a corrective without appearing to have done so deliberately. The structural conditions that had made both women indispensable began to dissolve in the years following the Second World War, and the dissolution was neither slow nor partial. Television arrived in American living rooms with a speed that the studios had underestimated and could not reverse. By the early 1950s, the weekly attendance figures that had sustained the studio system's economics through 3 decades of uninterrupted production were falling in ways that the industry's internal projections had not anticipated. The contract system, the arrangement by which studios owned actors, directors, and writers under long-term exclusive agreements that gave the studios near total control over who appeared in what picture and under what conditions, came apart under the pressure of antitrust litigation, changing economics, and the simple arithmetic of an audience that was staying home in increasing numbers to watch a small, glowing screen in the corner of the parlor. What the contract system's dissolution meant for Luella was this. The studios no longer had the same reasons to court her. The information they had traded her, the exclusive announcements, the contract signings, the casting decisions that she had been the first to report, had value only as long as those decisions were centrally controlled and could be strategically released. When stars began negotiating their own arrangements, when agents replaced studio executives as the primary architects of a performer's career, the information economy that Luella had inhabited for 30 years lost its organizing structure. She was a columnist built for a system that was ceasing to exist. Confidential magazine arrived in 1952, and it operated by rules that Luella had never used and would not have recognized as journalism. Founded by Robert Harrison in New York, Confidential ran stories about the private lives of celebrities that the studios in the old system would have suppressed through the same network of relationships and obligations that had made Luella's column function. It paid sources directly. It published without the consent or cooperation of the studios. It reached a readership of 4 million by its third year, and it did so by offering exactly the kind of material that Luella had spent 30 years carefully managing, releasing some of it, suppressing the rest, calibrating always against the obligation she carried. The studios were not helpless before Confidential. What they did, in a number of documented cases, was supply the magazine with information about performers whose careers they wished to damage or whose contracts they wished to escape, while using their remaining influence, with columnists like Luella to contain the fallout where it served them. The mechanism had changed, the logic had not. The industry was still trading information for outcomes. It had simply found a more efficient instrument. In the autumn of 1953, a column item appeared in Luella's dispatch concerning an actress named Dorothy Dandridge, who had just completed work on a picture at 20th Century Fox and was in negotiation for a second. The item did not make a direct accusation. It noted with the particular oblique precision that Luella had refined over decades that certain aspects of Miss Dandridge's conduct during the production had given pause to the executives responsible for the picture's completion. The source of the information was a Fox publicity executive whose name does not appear in the public record, but whose role in the transaction was later reconstructed by biographer Samantha Barbas from correspondence in the studio's archive. The negotiation for Dandridge's second picture at Fox did not proceed. She did not work at that studio again. This was the withheld thing. Not a rumor, not an inference, but a transaction. A studio executive with a specific professional interest in a specific outcome, supplying a specific item to a specific columnist who printed it in the specific form most likely to produce the desired result. The column was the instrument. It had been the instrument for 30 years. What changed in the early 1950s was only that the record, in certain cases, became recoverable, that the correspondence survived, that the names could eventually be matched to the actions, that the machinery could be seen whole rather than only in its individual operations. We read her column every morning. We trusted it as something resembling independent observation. We never asked who had placed the item there or what they had received in return. The column continued to run. The byline continued to appear in the Los Angeles Examiner and in the papers that still carried the Hearst Syndicate's content. But William Randolph Hearst had died in the summer of 1951 in the house in Beverly Hills where he had spent his final years, and the organization he had built was in the process of the kind of institutional reorientation that follows the death of the person who had been both its engine and its primary meaning. The new Hearst executives valued the column because it had always been valued. They maintained it as a matter of institutional continuity rather than conviction. The calls from studio heads had grown less frequent. The exclusives had grown less exclusive. Luella was 72 years old, and she was still filing 6 days a week, still maintaining the routine that had organized her life since the 1920s, still arriving at the typewriter with the same deliberate attention that Adela Rogers St. John's had observed in the house on the other side of everything that had since occurred. The column went out. The column always went out. What it no longer commanded, in the rooms where it had once carried the weight of a verdict, was the same quality of silence that follows a sentence being read aloud for the first time. The calls stopped coming gradually, and then they stopped entirely, and the gradualness of it was in certain respects more difficult to account for than a clean break would have been. There was no announcement, no studio head telephone to say that the arrangement had concluded. The column continued to run in the Los Angeles Examiner and in the diminishing number of papers that still carried the Hearst Syndicate's entertainment coverage, and Luella continued to fill it 6 days a week with items about pictures and performers. But the items had changed in character in ways that the column's remaining readers may not have noticed, and that Luella herself was perhaps the last person positioned to assess clearly. She was in her middle 70s, living in the apartment on Maple Drive in Beverly Hills that she had moved to after the house had become too large and too expensive and too full of the particular silence that accumulates in rooms where the telephone has stopped ringing with the frequency it once did. Her health had been precarious for years. The drinking had left its mark on her constitution in ways that her doctors had been documenting since the early 1940s. And by the late 1950s, the precariousness had become something more settled and more final. She wrote through it. This was the fact about her that the historical record returns to with the consistency of something that matters. She wrote through everything, as she always had, because the column was the one structure that had organized her life longer than anything else she had known. What the column could not organize by that point was the industry it had spent 30 years covering. The studio system whose rhythms had given Luella's dispatches their subject and their urgency had dissolved into a new arrangement that operated on entirely different terms. The stars who had once returned her calls within the hour because the cost of not doing so was measurable and immediate were now managed by agents and publicists who had grown up in the new Hollywood and had no personal memory of what Luella's column had once been able to do. The younger performers she wrote about had, in many cases, never read her. They knew the name. They did not know what it had cost to be on the wrong side of it. Dorothy Dandridge, whose career Luella's column had helped damage in the autumn of 1953 through a planted item whose source was a Fox publicity executive, worked sporadically through the late 1950s and found that the casting opportunities she had earned through her nomination for the Academy Award for her performance in Carmen Jones in 1954 did not materialize in the ways they should have. She died in 1965 at 42 years old, in circumstances that the coroner attributed to an accidental overdose. Her name appears in Luella's published columns from that period only once, briefly in a notice of a picture she had completed. The item contains nothing that would suggest the earlier transaction had taken place. The archive, however, does. Constance Bennett, whose reassignment at RKO in 1937 had followed a carefully timed Parsons item by 3 weeks, continued to work in pictures and on the stage through the 1940s and into the 50s, though the leading roles that might have been hers in a different version of that decade did not come. She made a career of the work that remained available, which is what most people in her position did, because the alternative was not to work at all. She died in 1965, the same year as Dandridge, in a hospital in Fort Dix, New Jersey, at 60 years old. Biographer Samantha Barbas, whose examination of the Parsons archive produced the most thorough assessment of the column's operational history, concluded that Luella had functioned simultaneously as a genuine journalist, a Hearst instrument, a studio ally, and something that had no clean name in the professional vocabulary of her era, a private clearinghouse for information that could be deployed, withheld, or traded depending on the obligations active at any given moment. Barbas noted that Luella appears to have understood at some level and at various points in her career what the column had become, and that this understanding did not prevent her from continuing to operate the machinery. The record does not show remorse. It shows, instead, the column going out every morning, the byline appearing, the dispatches arriving on the desks of editors who were printing them in papers whose readership was declining year by year throughout the 1950s, until the syndication footprint that had once covered over 400 papers had contracted to something considerably smaller and considerably less consequential. The Hearst organization formally retired the column in 1965. Luella was 84 years old. She had been writing it in one form or another for more than 50 years. The retirement was handled with institutional courtesy. There were notices in the trade papers, brief appreciations from figures in the industry who remembered what the column had once represented. But the notices had the quality of remarks delivered at a ceremony that everyone present understood had come long after the actual end of the thing being commemorated. She moved in her final years between the Beverly Hills apartment and a care facility in Santa Monica, where she could be attended to more consistently than was possible in a private residence. The Santa Monica rooms were quiet in the way that such places are quiet, not the silence of a room where work is being done or deferred, but the silence of a room from which the world has largely withdrawn. Visitors came infrequently. Her daughter Harriet came when she could. There were, toward the end, very few others. Luella Parsons died on the 9th of December, 1972, in the care facility in Santa Monica. She was 91 years old. The room was small and faced away from the light. She was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, in the same grounds where a number of the people she had written about over 5 decades. The actors, the directors, the figures of the studio system whose names she had placed in the column every morning for 30 years, had been laid to rest before her. The last column she filed under her own name in the final weeks before the Hearst organization's retirement notice contained items about a picture in production at Universal, a contract signing at Warner Brothers, and a brief notice about an actress whose name most of the column's remaining readers would not have recognized. It was a dispatch indistinguishable in form from the ones she had been writing since 1925. It arrived at the papers that still ran it, was set in type, and appeared the following morning on the entertainment pages, beside the advertisements and the television listings, in the space that had been reserved for it for as long as most of the editors could remember. Then the space was empty.